Welcome back to the Student Hub Live. Well, this is our induction for taught postgraduates in education, childhood and youth. And in this section, we take a look at childhood and youth. And I'm joined by Martin, Robb and Jane Cullen. We've also got lots of widgets, these interactive tools that you can see on your screen if you are in the Watch and Engage option. So we've got our old map there. We'd like to know where you are. We've had lots of people coming in from various parts of the world. And Michelle said bye-bye. She's off now and feels very supported. So if you have just joined us, I hope you feel very supported too. Do ask any questions that we can try and put to our panel. And if you are watching this on catch-up, because we know people have very busy lives, and there is something that you haven't had covered, then do email us, studenthub@open.ac.uk. So in addition to telling us where you are, we'd like 3 words to describe your identity. We keep clearing these down, by the way, because different students may come into these different sessions. So if you could fill those in, that would be absolutely brilliant. And about your work setting, now that could be where you're studying or where you're working. Ideally where you're working, because a lot of the time these contexts will have a real impact into your studies. We'd also like to ask which module you're studying. You'll see a lot of numbers here. You might not know what they are, and I'm going to ask our panel to explain what E807, K802 and ED841 mean, and then there's other also there. And which age group are you most interested in studying? 0 to 5, 6 to 11, 12 to 18 or other. So if you could fill those in, just open the widget that you'd like to vote on, click on the answer that applies to you and then return the results and that will send. And if you are new to us, you'll notice that there are different ways that you can have the interface. On the bottom right hand corner, there are different ways to lay out your screen. So do choose the one that suits you best. Lee and Zach are feeding in any questions and general chit-chat from the audience at home. They also work on our student support team as well as being OU students. So they're in a very good position to answer questions you might have if you're new to the Open University, like where do I find my assessment? So do put any questions to them and they will do their best to help you. Lee and Zach, are you both all right?
We are fantastic. We're having a great afternoon. Lots of chat, isn't there, today, about all sorts of modules, postgraduate studies. Lots of people looking forward to this session, childhood and youth as well.
Thank you very much. Well, without further ado, then let me introduce you to Martin and Jane. Right, what are all these modules all about? Can you briefly explain them? Martin, you're our expert in childhood and youth.
Well, maybe Jane can talk about the overall structure, but basically there are 2 core compulsory modules in the Masters in Childhood and Youth, E807 and K802. Maybe Jane, just remind us what E807 is.
Okay, so if I can kind of step back a bit and just think a bit concurrently with Martin about the overall structure of the Masters in Childhood and Youth, and perhaps to explain first that unlike the Masters in Education, which is what we've been talking about earlier in the afternoon, then what the Masters in Childhood and Youth offers is a measure of flexibility in terms of module study. In other words, unlike the Masters in Education, the Masters in Childhood and Youth doesn't have to be studied in any particular order. So that the 3 modules, there are still, as ever, 3 60-credit modules, but these modules can be studied in any particular order, and it's what, I hope it doesn't sound too flippant, but it's what I always refer to as a kind of mix and match approach, so that students might start with a module that they particularly like, or they might start with a module that they find particularly challenging, but it gives them the option of actually suiting the way in which they order their study to the time that they've got available to study it. So this particular qualification is always studied over 3 years. So this isn't one with a fast track option exactly. So it's studied over 3 years, either 3 consecutive years. But as always with Open University study, then study can be interrupted. Students can take a year off and come back to it a little later. So if we start with E807, and I think one of the things that has been referred to by you, Karen, I think quite a lot during today, is the way that we love letters and numbers in the Open University. And I think I was saying earlier today that I've been with the Open University for 10 years. And I think for a lot of those 10 years, I've been completely flummoxed by the way that letters and numbers are used.
The other day I was in a meeting and I said, oh, what does that mean? And nobody actually knew, and we realised we'd been talking about it, but I suddenly clocked that I actually didn't know what it meant. No. It is funny, isn't it? And speaking of letters, Lisa's got another birthday cake, which Lee has said can be posted in a jiffy bag. That sort of letter is absolutely fine as well.
Okay.
So the letters and numbers, Jane, sorry.
No,
digressed.
No, but you didn't digress, because I think one of the things that has only gradually permeated through to me over the course of 10 years is that the letters and numbers in important ways don't mean anything, if you understand what I mean. That there's a kind of randomness in the sense that E might stand for education, but an 8 might in some ways stand for postgraduate, but the actual E807 as a description of a module is something that is just assigned. It's not necessarily preceded by E806 or followed by E808. So, but the E807 is the module that is often taken as the first module. In other words, it's the one that the students choose to take first. And it focuses on childhood, and it focuses on that idea of children's worlds, if you like. I mean, I think that would be a kind of a good overall description. So it is childhood in the broadest possible way. This is moving away from a specific focus on education, and this is seeing childhood in all of its manifestations. So, for example, some of the early part of the study on E807 is about childhood and the politicisation of childhood. Some of the early study on E807 is about childhood and gender. Some of the later study on E807 is about childhood and family. And for example, the ways in which that very private space, which is family and childhood, interacts with tensions with childhood and the state. So as always with postgraduate study, I think, and this is following on from much of the conversation we've had earlier in the day, that at postgraduate level, this is about the interrogation of those states. It is also seeing childhood across the world. So there is a real global perspective to this look at childhood. And for example, there are case studies within E807 which are based on film from Hungary and which are based on film from South Africa. So this is looking at childhood not simply within a UK context, but childhood within some very different contexts, and contexts in which childhood is very differently viewed.
I wonder if we can take a look at the other module, because 25% of our students are studying K802, and I didn't want to put any embarrassment in here by asking you the title of the module, which I think is I can never remember the titles of the modules I teach on, but K802, Critical Practice with Children and Young People. It's one of the core modules, isn't it, Martin?
It is, and there are lots of similarities with the way Jane's described E807, and they do go together. They were conceived as two brother or sister modules some years ago, but there are some substantive differences as well. You could say that very crudely, if E807 is the theory, then K802 is the practice, and K802 is much more focused on working with children and young people. But again, as Jane says, this is postgraduate level, so it's not a how-to course. We're assuming that people have maybe studied childhood and youth or working with children and young people, or psychology or related studies at undergraduate level. They may be experienced professionals or practitioners who want to go deeper, who want to understand the broader context of the work they're doing. I should say you don't have to be working currently with children and young people. You could be a parent or just somebody who's got a general interest in the field. But you want to take that interest deeper. You want to look at the political context, the policy context, and take some of those issues like gender and the role of the state and the role of the family a bit further in a practical way. But I know from I've been on the module-wide forum for our module for this intake, and I know a lot of the students who I've talked to there have done E807 first. As Jane says, you can take them in either order, but we do find a lot of students have done E807, then they're now saying hello to each other on the module-wide forum on K802 and recognising old faces and old names that they've met before, which is rather nice.
Feeling. Oh, it's lovely, isn't it? And it just goes to show how important community is. I wanted to ask about this whole age group thing, because we asked everyone at home which age group they were most interested in studying. We had 20% of our audience saying 0 to 5 years, and then 40% saying 12 to 18 or other. So it seems like there's some quite big polarisation here between childhood and youth, depending on, of course, how you define those, which I imagine is not an argument we want to get into right here and now. What what is the relationship between age and what sorts of things might be covered then in this very broad childhood and youth
Shall I
programme?
take that with regard
Please.
to K802?
Yeah.
I mean, we've deliberately made K802, and I think the whole qualification, about both, and not tried to impose barriers and said, you're now going to move on from the 5 to 11 to the youth. And we have a very diverse student audience. I mean, again, looking at the module-wide forum, we ask people to introduce themselves, and most students have already, and we ask them to say where they're working, just as you do with your little emojis and so on. And it's incredibly broad. We've got people who are working in early years, who probably those 20% who are, say, 0 to 5. We've got people who are youth workers. We've got teachers. We've got health workers, social workers. And certainly the approach on 802 that we take is we'd like all students to study all age groups. We think it's important that you don't just study the age group you're working with, that you have a sense of what comes before, what comes afterwards, and you don't just study the sort of professional context in which you're working, that it's really good if you're a teacher, for example, to know what young people are doing outside of school, in youth work or scouts, guides, whatever. So it's a very broad, interdisciplinary, interprofessional, and diversely organised course, if you like, or module.
So what sorts of topics and subjects can people expect to be studying? Maybe, Jane, if you tell us about E807.
Well, I think I mentioned earlier that there is, and sort of if I can just row back slightly again, because I think one of the things that you mentioned there, Karen, was not going into definitions of childhood. But I think interestingly, and again, it's one of the things about studying at postgraduate level, that courses like this actually rehearse those tensions in those definitions, so that one of the things that E807 is doing is, and it's a word I've used already today, is interrogating those conceptions of childhood. And there are legal definitions of childhood, as we all know. There are folk definitions of childhood. There are folk definitions of early years, and I think very often, one of the starting places for students is the fact that those don't map onto each other in particularly easy ways, and through culture, through studies of culture, through studies of gender, we're always, not just through the study of a module like E807, but in our everyday experiences of the media, for example. Looking at the ways in which those senses of when does childhood end, when does adulthood begin, what's the bit in the middle, are being rehearsed and they are being questioned. Children's sexuality, there is, and I think, an incredibly healthy but complex debate at the moment about gender and transgender issues, for example, which is being enacted, I think, across not just social media, but the television, the newspapers at the moment. And it's questions like that which a module like E807 will be addressing.
So yes, if E807 is looking at sort of aspects of children's current lives globally, as well as Jane said, what we do when we switch the focus in K802 is to look at the sort of the professional context in which people who are working with children and young people find themselves. So we've got a whole block on what we call the organisational context. So how are services changing? What are the pressures on workers who are working with children and young people in all these different contexts, who are now being asked to work together in interagency ways? And so how's that environment changing? But we also look at some of the sort of boundaries between the personal and the professional, which I think is really interesting. To what extent is it okay to bring some of your personal life, your experience as a child, a former child yourself, or a young person, your experience as ex-child. Some of us were always young once,
some of us haven't left it behind.
or as a parent, into your work. So we've got some readings on people writing about being a mother and being a nurse, or being a mother and being a teacher. And, where do you draw the line? Is it okay to bring that experience in? Can you use that professionally? Do you have to critically reflect on that? Or do you need to draw some sort of boundary? So that's slightly different to E807, which is focused very much on the lives of children and the context of children's lives. Ours is the K802 is very much about the context of work with children and young people and how that's changing, and what are some of the issues that professionals and policymakers are having to face.
How do people negotiate that dimension of how much is appropriate to bring into it? Because, this is an applied course. And often people are in these settings where they are working with children or young people anyway. So how do you manage that tension then between the theoretical and the practical?
Well, there's quite a lot of emphasis in 802, and I think probably in the degree generally on reflective practice. In fact, we've got a whole unit in K802 on reflective practice, and we've got a really nice video of a practitioner doing that with some young people and with some children. So we're getting practitioners to really reflect on their practice critically and to use the ideas that they are engaging with in the module and relating them to their own personal experience and professional experience as well.
Right, let me take a quick trip to Lee and Zach and see how everyone is at home. And Lee and Zach, I hear we've had some lovely feedback from Atsuko.
Yeah, Tsuko said that he felt very much supported and gave us a goodbye from Japan. He's gone back to return to his studies. Jane's just come back. She was, I think, in this morning session or earlier this afternoon, and she's just had a gooey chocolate and beetroot cake with ice cream and toffee sauce. So I'm pretty jealous of that.
We are very jealous. We're down to our last biscuit. we're eking it out for the rest of the afternoon.
So back to this childhood and youth thing. I mean, I do appreciate, and the reason I didn't want to go into the complexities is because I end up in hour-long discussions. And it is absolutely fascinating because, as you say, Jane, there are so many complexities with who is making the decisions on what, and what time, and what place, and on what basis. So it is a massive issue. But if I were to sort of say, OK, childhood and youth, and we've looked at the different age groups, how much of these modules relates to children and youth? And is it that categorical, or are there various themes and methods that sort of intersperse between the two? I guess my point is that, we've asked our audience at home what sort of area they're most interested in, and you've mentioned that it's important to look at other areas apart from the ones that you're most interested in. So how has that all played out?
Do you want to talk about EHS7?
Well, I think, I was talking to Martin before we came in, and I said that if I was to summarise, I would say that E807 is more focused on children. However we define children, and I felt that K802 is more focused on youth.
And did he agree?
No.
All right. I thought that might be coming. See, this is what I mean. It's a complex battle. I don't like discussing with you lot.
I'm not an expert on 807, but I'm prepared to take James' word for that. But certainly K802, there may be more on youth, and there are some issues, obviously, that are more relevant to particular age groups. So we've got a fair amount on child protection issues in the organisational context, and obviously, most of the sort of media coverage has been around issues to do with young children there. So that's more relevant to people who are working with younger children. But we'd like to think that there are some cross-cutting themes that are relevant to people working in whatever professional context and with whatever age group. And that's what we're trying to get across, really, that increasingly in the outside world, in the world of work with children and young people, practitioners are being asked to work more and more across professional boundaries. So we've got a whole unit on interprofessional working, where people are working in teams, where you've got the police, social workers, youth justice workers, teachers, having to work together as part of a team. And that's increasingly happening. So we were aware a lot of our students are in that setting, are in that situation. So we're trying to respond to that and saying, let's not think of you in terms of these silos, these lanes, and say, well, you study that bit because you're a teacher, and you study that bit because you're a social worker. It's good for everyone to know what's going on in other people's service, because increasingly that's what you'll face in your work, that kind of interprofessional way of working.
But and I think those tensions are being rehearsed, in situations we're encountering in everyday life. So that, for example, there have been some recent and very shocking cases about grooming of girls, and historical cases of sexual abuse have often been actually challenging those ideas of whether those are children, which is the phrase that is being now used to refer to them, or whether they were actually at the time of the abuse being regarded as adults or young adults. So I think it is about simply that there are changing perspectives as well as those kinds of ambiguities between terms.
And just one more thing on that is the other thing that's changing is the definition of youth. And when we were writing this course, we were aware that some researchers on the area of youth work stretched the definition of youth to 25. With people coming back from universities to live with their parents. I know that's true for my children. And youth workers now say, well, we'll take people up to 25. There's this idea of youth being almost infinitely extended. So, as Jane says, the boundaries are very porous and very fluid.
To what extent, then, do you think age is important in this definition? Because, we've asked our students at home, which age groups they're most interested in studying, and we mention often age when we're looking at the parameters. But equally, you're talking about the historical nature and the situated nature and legal nature even of what we consider, in terms of this categorical children and youth thing. So how important is the age in all of this then? Is it not very important or very, very important in terms of reaching a definition?
That's a great question.
Shall I go on to another one?
No. I think
we struggle to provide an answer.
No, absolutely.
We don't want to provide an answer to our students. We want them to explore
only
that
5
question.
minutes. It is. Well, the one thing I'm sitting and reflecting on here as I'm reflecting is the extent to which you say a lot of this is rehearsed, because culturally we're very used to thinking about age in terms of numerical parameters and categories in a very Western society. It'd be very interesting. It's a shame that some of our friends from China and Japan have maybe gone, because maybe they think about things in a slightly different way, because, like you say, we often approach things from a given position, don't we?
Yes. No, I think, and some of that position is in policy and legal frameworks. Some of that, is in children's charters, like the United Nations, rights of the child. But some of that is about, or perhaps takes as its starting point local cultural conditions. I think one of the things that you would know, Karen, that I do a lot of work in international development, and situations in various countries that I've worked in across Africa, in Bangladesh with child brides, with young girls being married off at the age of 10. Those situations are actually bring that idea about, well, is it age, is it legality, is it about children's rights right to the fore of that, and it's not simply that you don't make a decision on that, but I think at postgraduate level you are taking all of the arguments into consideration about the kinds of decisions you make, and therefore about the kinds of attitudes that you end up with.
But it's not just about age going down, is it, Lee? Because somebody's been saying on the chat that sometimes, they agree that the definition of youth can extend into the 20s.
Absolutely. A few people have had comments on this. Jan Thompson agrees that youth does extend into the early 20s. And Janet's just asked, is stage more important than age?
Oh, a very good question. Because often we do study stage theory, in sort of childhood, and that's a very interesting categorical definition again.
Yeah, I mean, it's a hugely debated area, as you know, particularly in child psychology. And I think what's interesting is about this degree is childhood and youth studies is a fairly new area, fairly new territory. It's come out of sort of sociology of childhood, and a lot of the writers on childhood and youth studies have been quite critical of a lot of traditional developmental psychology and the whole ages and stages approach. So I don't want to give any categorical answers. I just want to reassure students, if you find these things interesting, you will find these subjects debated, and you'll be able to bring your own experience and your own perspectives. We have a whole section on culture, for example, on working with culture as a practitioner in K802. So there's a chance to work on those issues, write about them, and so on.
OK, we're nearly out of time, but I do want to touch on assessment and contact with students. So let's briefly cover contact. What sort of contact, especially for students who are very new to the Open University, might they expect to have? We've spoken a bit about forums, etc., but roughly how much contact might they expect to have, both with their tutor and their peers throughout the module?
I think the answer is a lot, and I think the more that they want to interact, the more contact that they will have. I think one of the things that the Open University does incredibly well. I mean, our tutors, our associate lecturers are the front and foremost in terms of our of the relationship with the students and in terms of the relationship any OU student has with the university. And they are magnificent. I mean, they're magnificent in terms of their professionalism. Anyone who's teaching on one of the postgraduate courses has a postgraduate degree, and they are incredibly expert and incredibly professional and incredibly kind. I mean, the amount of goodwill I think that goes with tutoring is not to be,
because they often tutors are employed part-time, and they often
Absolutely.
work for other institutions, and mainly because they love the OU and they have a
Absolutely.
passion for lifelong learning, and for the social mobility that often studying.
Absolutely. So there is a extensive formal tuition on childhood and youth, as with the Masters in Education. And that there is tuition by forum, and then there is all of that ad hoc and informal contact between tutor and student that goes on as well. And I think one of the things that tutors are incredibly good at is supporting those students most who need it most.
Yeah.
Some won't, some will need it more, and they will get the support that they want.
We mustn't forget peer-to-peer contact. Students do have the opportunities to talk to each other. I mentioned our module-wide forum. It's great for students to introduce themselves, find other people from the same part of the world or a similar professional background, or somebody else who says, I'm new to the OU, I have no idea what I'm doing. That's really reassuring. So go on the module-wide forum if you haven't introduced yourself, and talk to the students who are there.
And we'll be covering all of that in our next session when we take a look at whether serious academics can make good use of social media like Facebook and Twitter. Before we do that, though, I want to just tackle the difficult subject of assessment. How are students assessed on these modules?
Okay,
very
so-
briefly.
807.
Yeah, so E807 first of all, then there are 4 TMAs on E807.
It's a tutor marked assignment.
Tutor marked assignment, and then an EMA, which is the end of module assignment. So interestingly, 3 of the TMAs, tutor marked assignments, are conventional in the sense of that there being a conventional piece of writing by the individual student against one of the topics. TMA 4 is really different, and it's a collaborative wiki.
Wow.
So students are divided into groups, and they actually produce a group piece of writing. So this is picking up on what Martin was talking about peer-to-peer interaction. But this is collaboration. I think it's something that frankly we don't do enough of, and we don't celebrate enough. And that is how much learning and teaching is enacted through collaboration, and how important it is in our professional lives. So that's a specific TMA on E807. And for the EMA, then it is a small project which can either be desk-based, which is a literature review, or it can be a small-scale piece of inquiry. So either what we call a piece of empirical research, or it can be a desk-based review of literature.
And on 802, I can't go without saying that we do have an exam, and I know lots of students on the forum are anxious about the fact that we do have an exam. For many students, it may be the first exam they're taken in half a lifetime. But the reassuring thing is that the assessment structure on K802 is if a unit has been assessed in the tutor marked assignments, it won't be assessed again.
So you can take a strategic approach.
Students can work out which 3 units will be assessed in the exam. So they only have to revise those 3 units. So,
and of course, you can write a lot less in an exam than you can on a
and we understand
TMA.
that. We understand
Well, you
that.
can, and I think they're easier for that reason. And also, you've got that clarity with all that adrenaline going on of focus.
It's nice to hear some support for exams.
I think they're brighter. No, it is, because they are nerve-wracking and things, but having done a lot of them and also having marked a lot of them, when you see how much you can actually do in a 3-hour time period, you think, actually, I would go for that given the choice, because I think it's an awful lot easier. Lee and Zach, how are you both there?
We're doing really well. And Jane, who is not long back from shopping, would love to know. She's quite interested in youth and childhood studies. And she's got a thought that this sort of extends throughout all aspects of our life as adults as well. And she'd like to know what our panel's views are on that sort of interesting thought that perhaps influences in your childhood extends to your adult life as well.
Oh, my goodness.
That's a big question.
That is a massive question. Right, let's see if we can answer that in 30 seconds each. And maybe with relation to stage theories and trajectories. That would be a nice finishing touch.
No, I think I'm simply going to answer it in terms of being the eternal child, and I think that the influences of childhood absolutely permeate our adulthood. And if we're incredibly lucky, we never stop being children.
And I'd like to say that our students are encouraged to bring their own childhood and youth experience into their study, and it never goes away. And they're not just writing about the children they're working with, they're writing about themselves as well, and that's valid.
Wow, excellent. Well, there's food for thought. Thank you very much, Jane and Martin, for that thought-provoking session. I hope you've enjoyed it at home. Right, well, we're now going to take a look at K802 with a short video break, and then we'll be back to take a look at social media with Alison and Azuma. See you soon.